I live in an RV, so I'm constantly moving around the country. But a few months out of the year, I have to stay in one area for an extended time. This in order to accumulate some before moving on. At the time, I was staying somewhere in southern Utah and had taken a job at a gas station. This was located on a road that was really only used by locals to get in and out of the state without having to deal with freeway traffic. So there was nothing else on this route. It was just a road with a lone gas station for casual drivers. So the job was perfect for me because the location didn't matter. To me, it's one of the fascinating things about living on wheels. So I decided to stay there for a while and work anyway. I had been there for a little over a month, and up to this point, I was still working random shifts. That day, I was working from 10 p.m. to 6:00 a.m. It really wasn't a special night by any means, but like all the previous ones, almost no C customers aside from the one or two that stopped at the pumps, and not much to do really. Most of the time, I was just standing around looking at my phone or walking around the store and making the shelves look nice that night. However, at about 1 a.m., a customer pulled into the station parking lot in one of the few spaces right in front of the door. Seeing him, I went back to the counter to serve him. The man got out of his car and walked into the store. He looked at me. Me smiled and then nodded. I nodded back and he continued down one of the aisles. As I was checking the grocery aisle, the man started whistling as he looked at a couple of things, picking them up and putting them back, then continued down the next aisle and repeated that same action. I wasn't sure if he was just taking a break from driving or if he really needed something, but the items he was picking up and looking at were all different, and he didn't really seem interested in buying them. Then he abruptly stopped whistling, walked over to the door, and left at the time. I didn't think he stole anything, but it was strange the guy got into his car, and through the windshield, which had no smoked paper on it, I could see that he started looking for something in the back seat before getting back out of his car and walking back into the store after seeing what he had just done. I didn't feel too comfortable. I didn't know what it was he had been looking for in the back seat or why he had returned to the store. I wanted to think that maybe he had left his wallet there and that was what he had gone out to get, but I wasn't too convinced as judging by his odd attitude. This seemed almost exactly how I thought an armed robbery would start. However, the assault I expected when he re-entered the store didn't happen. Instead, he approached the counter and asked me how my night was going. Starting a quick back and forth of small talk, I acted as normally as I could, trying to disguise the fact that I was overthinking everything. But then he asked me if I could help him with his car, said his tires needed air and that he didn't see any pumps outside the station. The truth is I didn't have any air pumps at the gas station, but I did carry a handheld air compressor for emergency situations, so I pulled it out and followed him to his car. He pointed down to where the tire was that needed air, and I bent down, placing the line on the compressor. I had it there for less than 10 seconds while I read the pressure, which turned out to be at the correct level. I then looked up at the man to tell him the tire was okay. But when I did, what I saw was his fist coming straight. From my face, I fell to the ground, stunned, and tried to get up. But then the man started kicking me wildly. I started screaming at him to stop curling up on the ground and covering my head with my arms, trying to protect myself. But he kept kicking me mercilessly and without giving me a chance at anything. The way he was doing it was so brutal, I felt each blow as if I was being hit with a hammer, and I really thought it was the end of me. Finally, the man stopped kicking me, and as I lay on the ground in pain, motionless and barely half-conscious, I watched in horror as he pulled a knife from his belt and, in a swift manner, and without any hesitation whatsoever, put it to my neck and slid it from side to side. This happened in a split second, but to me it felt like it was in slow motion as I could feel the edge of the blade on every millimeter of my skin. Instinctively, I brought my hands to the wound, trying to hold back the gushing blood, but I knew it was useless. No one survives a cut to the jugular, so I just stood there in a fetal position, looking out into the darkness of the deserted road ahead, bleeding out as the guy walked calmly towards the store. I don't know how much time passed, but I began to hear the man's footsteps approaching. I was still conscious, although I didn't know for how much longer. In fact, I was surprised that I hadn't died yet. as I understood that a cut in the neck meant a quick death. And although I was sure that my death was imminent anyway, the survival instinct is something that just doesn't go out as long. As I had some life left, so I decided to close my eyes and play dead. When I heard him approaching, standing there, I could hear the man put a bunch of stuff inside the van. You could hear the sound of the items bumping into each other and being piled in the back seat. Then I heard him stop his steps to the side of me. I knew he was looking at me. I could feel it, so I held my breath and stood as still as I could. A couple of seconds later, I heard him get into the truck, turn it on, and felt the tires brush against me as I backed out of the parking lot. I heard the car pull out of the spot and onto the highway, and when I stopped hearing the engine, I got up off the ground as best I could, still pressing my neck with my hands, and walked toward the store, dizzy, izzy, and staggering. I couldn't believe I was still alive, even though I felt so weak and dizzy that I knew I would pass out at any moment, but still in the middle of the mess the man had left. I managed to see my cell phone still placed next to the cash register, which was now open, and with a pile of coins strewn about. I dialed 911, and with my last thread of consciousness, I told them as briefly as I could where I was and that my throat had been cut. That's the last thing I remember before everything went dark, and I was completely unconscious when I opened my eyes again. I was in a hospital bed with a nurse injecting something into the hose attached to the back of my left hand. Immediately after she looked at me, she began to call the doctor immediately. The memories of what happened began to hit me, and then I brought my hands to my neck and realized that I was bandaged. I honestly could not believe that I was alive, and I was very grateful for that because surviving that was a possibility. I never thought about, in fact, when I called 911, what was going through my mind was that I wanted them to find my body and inform my family of my death. I later learned that probably because I was overweight, the knife did not penetrate deep enough to cut any major veins, and although it came very close, it never reached the jugular vein, and that was the only reason I was alive, because the man miscalculated where he made the cut. I have no words to describe how grateful I am to be alive, but without a doubt this experience was enough to never work the night shift again, much less alone in the middle of music nowhere. 10 years ago, I was working the night shift at a 24-hour restaurant. This job had its ups and downs. The pay was decent and the hours were long and quiet. The place had a steady stream of regular truckers and the occasional night owl craving a cup of coffee and a slice of pie to sweeten the night I had been. Working there for about a year, and my shift started at 11 p.m. and continued until 7 a.m. I had been working there for about a year. This was a small restaurant most nights. It was just Haim the cook, a gruff man in his 50s, and me who was in charge of serving customers and taking their orders. One of our regular customers was a man named David. He was about 40 years old, stocky bald with a thick beard, and had a habit of wearing the same brown leather jacket. Every time he came in, David was a somewhat reclusive guy. He usually sat at the counter and drank his coffee staring into the void, never caused any trouble, and came in a couple of times a week, always at the same time between 2 and 3 a.m. He would order the same thing, sit in the same place. And after an hour or two leave, David was one of those customers you get used to. However, about a month ago, something had changed. He started to come more frequently. It was no longer every 2 or 3 nights he came every night and sat at the counter, but now instead of looking into the void, he started to look at me. But it wasn't a casual look. It was more of an insistent look, a look that followed me everywhere, almost without blinking. At first, I ignored it. I was used to dealing with my share of lonely night shift customers who wanted to chat, and I assumed David had finally decided to join the club. At first, he was subtle, asking me how I was doing, if I was tired, if I ever got scared working alone at night. His questions were a bit personal, but I answered them, politely, not wanting to be rude, but then he started leaving bigger tips, $10 to $20. One time, he even left me $50, all for a cup of coffee and a slice of cake. Not that I was complaining, but my experience told me that that kind of generosity from a man is never selfless. One night after I refilled his coffee, he came a little closer and said, "You're too pretty to work in a place like this at night. You never know who might come over." I laughed at the time, but I didn't. really find his comment funny, and the way he said it made my skin crawl. I tried to avoid him after that, keeping my conversation short and to the point. But he kept coming back, and his behavior got stranger one night. He came in with a small gift, a necklace. He handed it to me with a smile that made me uneasy. I saw this and it reminded me of you. He said. I hesitated to accept it. I politely told him I couldn't receive it and thanked him for taking the trouble, but he insisted on placing it on the counter in front of me. I left it there, hoping he would retrieve it when he left, but he didn't. After he left, I threw it in the trash a few nights later. Things took a darker turn one day around 3 a.m. The restaurant was empty except for David, who was sitting in his usual spot at the counter. Hay was in the back taking a smoke break, and I was wiping down the counter trying to ignore the way David's eyes followed me everywhere. Suddenly, David broke the silence with a thought that crossed his mind. He commented on how easy it would be to subdue someone like me. In a place like this, the mere suggestion scared me and sent a shiver down my back. My hand tightly clenched the rag I was using to clean, and David smiled, but there was nothing friendly in that smile. I understood exactly what he said. Being alone here most nights, I was vulnerable to anyone with bad intentions, and the thought of what could happen if someone decided to hurt me felt terribly real. I forced a laugh, trying to take it as a joke. He didn't respond. He just kept looking at me, and his smile never wavered. After what seemed like an eternity, he finished his coffee, left a large bill on the counter, and walked out without another word. I stood there for a long time after he left, staring at the door, my mind racing, as I remembered his haunting words and the strange moment I had just had with this man. I knew I had to do something. I had to tell someone, hey, the police, someone. But I didn't want to make a big fuss out of nothing, so I decided not to let myself get paranoid and put the matter aside. The next night, David didn't show up at the restaurant for the first time. In weeks, I felt a sense of relief. So great, I can't even describe it. I thought maybe he had finally gotten the message and decided to leave me alone. But just as I was closing the register, the phone rang. I picked it up, expecting it to be Hay or a late night order. But instead, there was only silence. On the other end of the line, I was about to hang up when suddenly I heard a low, hoarse sigh followed by David's voice. "Did you miss me?" he whispered into the phone. I hung up with a jolt and looked around the restaurant in panic, expecting to see him standing outside, but the parking lot was empty. I ran to the back, found Haim, and told him what happened. He tried to calm me down, saying it was probably just a joke the next night, and the next were the same. There was no sign of David in the place, but the phone calls continued. Each time it was the same silence. And then David's voice saying something creepy that gave me goosebumps. I knew I couldn't go on like this. My anxiety was through the roof. I could barely sleep. I was nervous all the time, and I began to dread my shifts. At the restaurant, I told Haim about the calls, but there wasn't much he could do. The police didn't take it seriously either and said they couldn't do much without more concrete evidence. Then a phone call. I felt really desperate and very helpless, as it seemed that no one could do anything for me. Honestly, this man's attitude was starting to seriously worry me. One night, after several weeks of just calling David came back to the restaurant. It was around 3 a.m. Just as before, I was wiping down the counter, trying not to think about the phone calls. When the door creaked open, I looked up, and there he was standing in the doorway. I swear, at that moment, I just wanted to run and lock myself in the back room. But I didn't. I was frozen in the same spot. David walked up to the counter, sat down across from me, and asked me why I hadn't answered his calls. I instinctively stepped back, trying to create some space between us. But distance offered little comfort, and told him to go away. He replied that he wasn't going anywhere until he got what he wanted, an answer that promised nothing but danger. I began to panic and looked back in hopes that Haim would return, but the door remained closed, and I was alone. I tried to reach for the phone to call the police, but David moved faster and his hand shot out, grabbing my wrist. I knew I had to get away from him. So with my free hand, I grabbed the coffee pot off the counter, then planted it on his head with such force that he let go of my wrist and began to stagger. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I just ran out to the back room, screaming at the top of my lungs for help, and calling for Hay. When we both got back to the front, David was gone, The police took my report more seriously after that, especially when they saw the bruise on my wrist. They searched the area but did not find David. They promised to keep an eye on the restaurant and my house, but I could no longer work there because the thought of going back and seeing David terrified me, so I quit. The next day I changed my phone number, moved to a new apartment, and tried to start over. But even though I was no longer working at the restaurant, I couldn't help but feel unsafe everywhere I went. So a few months later, I went back to my hometown and stayed at my parents' house for a while. It was only from there that I started to feel safe again, and I was able to resume my life. Music. Normally I was 25 years old when this happened. This was not my first night shift job, but it was the only one where I worked completely alone, and it would also be the last such job I would ever take in my life. Now, before I share this story, let me tell you up front, I was not under the influence of any drugs, nor had I been drinking, being completely honest. The reason I ended up living and working where I did was because I had just completed a detox and subsequent residential stay in a drug treatment program. So oddly enough, you could say I was as sober as possible. This was definitely not one of the best times of my life. But in the end, we live and learn from these moments. Anyway, well enough dizzying you with my background. The thing is, I worked the night shift as a maintenance man at a large retirement community located in the city of Temple, Texas in late 2011. Day, I arrived at 7 p.m. as I did every day. My checkout was at 6 a.m. and the seniors did not have to check out of what I will call the community building and return to their own individual apartments until 9 p.m. So there would be a window of about 2 hours in the community building to have a lot of older, friendly, chatty people milling around, playing cards, chatting, exercising, and that sort of thing. These people couldn't be warmer and more welcoming. It felt like when I was a kid visiting my grandparents, but these were like 100 grandparents. So this 2-hour gap where these seniors were gathered, there was my favorite part of the day. But then when the clock struck 9:0 p.m. sharp, there would be a drastic change in the energy of the place that I'll never forget. I noticed that at each shift as the clock approached 9:0 p.m., an uncomfortable sense of dread and anticipation would come over me. It was so heavy and palpable that I knew I would soon be isolated in that huge, silent building all alone. Or at least it would seem that way. In that way, I knew unconsciously that something was going on, but I always tried to ignore that feeling in the building. There were windows that covered almost the entire structure, and they overlooked the outside parking lot. This building was arranged in a kind of U-shape or horseshoe shape, whatever you want to call it. The thing is that due to its shape from one hallway, you could look across the parking lot and also see the other hallway, which constituted the other half of this U. I do not know if you guys understand, but the truth is that in that stretch, I constantly used to see someone or something walking through the hallways. It was just strange. At first, I kept thinking that surely it was just the blinds open in a certain way, or the shadow of the surrounding trees that gave the illusion of a human form, but this was just an attempt to lie to myself, because deep down, I knew that this was impossible. I encountered this figure practically every day. It was very strange because at first, whenever I saw him, it was as if he was walking in my direction, but from the other hallway, and sometimes he seemed to imitate my movements. That is, if I moved to one side, he did too. If I was walking and suddenly stopped, he did too. And when I tried to get closer to see who or what he was, he just disappeared. But I knew it wasn't a shadow of me first, because of the distance I was at. And second, because there was no light, no beacon that could cast my shadow. Like that also, this kind of shadow moved at will, and when it imitated me, it was not an immediate movement, but a delayed one. Like when you were a child and your friend wanted to annoy you by playing the silly imitation game, in which he repeated everything you did and said something like that. I never succeeded in trying to figure it out or catch it. Most of the time I would see it and try to run over there, but it always slipped away. And there was literally nowhere for anyone to hide or go except forward or back down the hallway and past me. But I never found anyone, and that only served to heighten my suspicions. that something very strange was going on inside this place. Not necessarily something evil or threatening, but it was there. And I knew I was there too, since this was not really a commercial establishment, but rather a collection of community buildings. As I said before, we employees both during the day and during the evenings did not have a proper break room. So we all used the building's cafeteria space, as well as the refrigerator, microwave, and coffee maker that were there, which were actually meant to be used by the elderly when it came time to have breakfast or their snacks throughout the day. I can't count the number of times I felt like having a quick pick-me-up coffee, or maybe a complimentary Jell-O or snack or a slice of cake, and that night was no exception. As it was close to midnight, I was craving a hot cup of coffee, as it was getting a bit chilly, so I headed for the coffee shop, and as I rounded the corner before I got in the area, a nurse from the hospice wing was also rounding the corner from her side of the complex, scaring the hell out of me as I came face to face with her. Just imagine being about 5 or 6 hours into your shift and you haven't seen or heard a single person's voice, or at least 3 or 4 hours except step for that ghostly figure you can never seem to really locate. And suddenly, boom, you run face to face with someone totally unexpected. I was just short of letting out a high-pitched squeal like a scared little girl. At the time, the nurse must have thought I was a freak, since upon seeing her I almost had a heart attack. I apologized to her and tried to say something funny regarding the encounter. She smiled at me too. And then another nurse caught up with her. I made the coffee and served them both, and for the next 5 or 10 minutes, we had a little friendly chat in the break area, or rather in the seniors coffee bar that we used as a break area. These nurses kept coming in on several occasions during the night. This gave me the opportunity to at least have contact with other human beings during my night shift, which lowered my stress levels a bit. So over the following weeks and months, I got used to expecting someone to be in that break area at least once or twice during my long work shift. This helped me cope better with the overwhelming feeling of loneliness, as well as that other heavy, unsettling feeling that settled into the atmosphere once the seniors returned to their rooms. And I was left alone on shift, however, that new feeling of companionship that allowed me to be able to let my guard down and not constantly be a walking nervous wreck came to an end one night when I was in what I called the cul-de-sac, which ironically was actually the side of the U where the hallway ended in an office, a gym and a physical therapy room, while on the other side of the U I had a door that led to more empty rooms and offices. I must say that place had a special energy, as there you always felt as if something was behind you, watching you, stalking you. It was a very strong and very unsettling feeling. The worst part was having to slide a vacuum cleaner down there because you constantly felt the need to turn around and check your back, as you couldn't rely on sounds to alert you. The thing is, one day I was cleaning the cul-de-sac, and other than that creepy feeling, everything was going pretty normal. But then something strange caught my attention through the window overlooking the back parking lot. There was a dimly lit sidewalk that bordered the building and led to a separate parking lot. This one was for employees only, and was in the back there, standing in the corner of that wall and almost trying to camouflage itself in the shadows, was a very tall, thin figure, half physical form, half parturition, and very demonic looking. This figure was about 80 feet tall, but when you looked down at its feet, it simply vanished. It was not a full or solid figure. Until around the upper thigh, its torso was bare, revealing misshapen ribs and a bluish-white skin color. Much like a corpse, its arms were extremely long, as were its hands, whose fingers ended in what looked like pointed claws, and did not appear to be 5 fingers, but rather 3, 4. I was completely paralyzed at the sight of him, bewildered but also filled with terror. When I looked up into its face, I felt my heart freeze. Its face was that of a caravel, but not a human one, but like that of a goat, but with long locks of hair falling to the sides, and its huge horns curled up. The creepiest thing, however, was that those empty sockets it had for eyes seemed to be staring straight at me. But it wasn't its hideous statue that terrified me the most. It was what I felt as its gaze drilled into me the moment our gazes met. Something happened that I still can't explain today, and that is that the terror I felt was mixed with other feelings. Suddenly, an enormous feeling of emptiness and desolation began to invade me. I felt sad, desperate, and tormented. I felt an enormous desire to scream and cry, to get down on my knees. Images of my disastrous life began to flash through my head, filling me with anguish, despair, and sadness. My body was filled with overwhelming feelings. Shame, pain, loss, despair it was, as if the most devastating feelings for a human being were crowding inside me at the same time, making me feel a torment that I had never experienced before in my life. And fortunately not afterwards either. The experience was so intense that I felt nauseous, weak, my body was shaking, and before I knew it, I was crying my eyes out. At one point, I simply couldn't take it and looked away from him or whatever it was that was standing there. I felt oppressed, suffocated, and fell to the floor on my knees, my hands on my chest, trying to breathe through all the emotional turmoil inside me at that moment. I swear, I felt like I was going to die, so much so that I lay on the floor in a fetal position, hugging my legs to my chest, waiting for my heart to just stop beating at one point. And honestly, with all the horrible things I was feeling, it really did seem like death was a lucky thing. I lay there on the floor in that position for I don't know how long, but when I finally had the strength to stand up, I looked out the window again in terror, but the figure was no longer there. It was gone, and fortunately, that was the first and last time I got to see it. After that experience, I started cleaning the cul-de-sac when there were still people around. That is before the old people returned to their apartments. If I had had another choice, maybe I would have moved and found another job, but I didn't have that option at the time. So I kept working every night, feeling terrified of meeting that figure again. But there was something interesting about that entity, something I thought about in the days that followed, and that is that the place where I was standing was a palliative care area, a place where we lost at least one person every 2 weeks, basically. That's where terminally ill patients spend their last days. This made me think about the feelings that overwhelmed me that night when I looked that figure in the eye. And the reason why I was standing right there, my theory about it is that that entity was indeed a demon. I don't know anything about demonic entities. Maybe if any of you have knowledge about that, you will know how to explain it better or understand what it was about, or maybe you will know what kind of demon specifically it was, but I am sure it was. Personally, I believe that this entity fed on all the negative feelings that could overwhelm these people who saw their lives slipping through their fingers. All those feelings of loss, desolation, sadness, total hopelessness, homesickness, emptiness, and fear. I am sure that this was the reason why I was there, and also that this entity was responsible for that oppressive feeling that was felt all over the place. When I was left alone, it was a couple more years before I was able to move and find another job. And during all that time, there was a latent fear inside me of meeting this being again. But as I said before, I had no other alternative. However, I tried as much as possible to relax by listening to music, talking to the nurses and the like. But it was not easy. I didn't tell anyone about it either, because I really didn't want to tell an old man who might eventually get his turn in palliative care that there was a demonic entity on the other side of the wall that would be cruel. So instead, I kept this experience to myself for many years, until today when I am sharing it with you. My name is Linda and I am 23 years old. A couple of years ago, I got a job at a 24-hour grocery store. I was in college and just wanted some money to cover my expenses and hang out with my friends. My study schedule was in the afternoon, so the evening hours were perfect for me. After a couple of months of working there, I started to get used to the regular customers. Most of them were nice or just average people, but there was also this one guy who was kind of weird and always gave me a bad feeling. He would arrive most nights between 11 and 12 p.m. and walk around the store for a long time before getting one or two cheap items. And coming to the checkout whenever I arrived, I could always catch this. This man looking at me strangely on several occasions. He was a guy of about 40 or 45, small and thin. He had long hair and an unkempt beard. He also had a very particular way of walking, kind of penguin-like, and in general, he was Someone strange, he just didn't give me any confidence. He never talked much. But I had assumed he lived on the street or in his car, and that would explain why he only bought things like chips and snacks. Also the fact that his clothes were never clean and he looked unkempt. Everywhere, several weeks if not months went by, and the man kept coming in almost daily and doing the exact same thing all the time. So at one point I stopped thinking about it. It was now a very normal part of my job, but one night he came in as usual, only instead of walking through the store, he went straight to the cash register. I asked him if he needed help with anything, and the man just looked at me for a second before asking me if I was the one driving the old Toyota that was in the parking lot. This seemed a little strange to me as he knew that, but then I thought it must be obvious as it was probably the only car that was there every day and in the same place. But on the other hand, I found it somewhat disturbing that this person would notice it as. That would mean he was more aware of me than I thought. However, I tried to shake off my paranoid thoughts and just told him yes, because I thought maybe it was that there was something wrong with my car. But the man kept a straight face and walked away from the cash register without saying anything else. That was very strange. So I asked my coworker to watch the registers for a moment, and then I went to the front of the store and looked outside. I went into the parking lot and my car was right where I had parked it, and there didn't seem to be anything wrong with it. I went back to the register thinking I would ask the man about it when he came to pay, but he never did. I don't know when he left, but the store closed without him coming to the register, like he always used to that night. When I left, I checked my whole car and nothing seemed out of place. It left me just confused the next day. I planned to ask him again as I had actually been very intrigued by his question the night before, but the guy didn't come that day or the next or for the entire next month. The strange man seemed to have simply vanished, leaving me in doubt, but it wouldn't be long before I found out why he was so interested in knowing if the car was mine one Monday at about 5 a.m. When it was still dark, I left work as usual. Sunday night was the only night of the week that I was alone at the register, so at the end of the day, I always left alone, but that early morning when I started walking across the parking lot to my car, I had a really strange feeling in my gut. Maybe I just remembered it wrong, or maybe there really was some intuition about something, but I remember feeling that something was wrong from the moment I set foot outside the store, so I walked quickly and got into my car looking around the parking lot. Nervously, it was practically empty, and I had nothing to give me reason to believe anything was wrong. But somehow I knew something was out of place. I started my car, and just before I put it in gear, I heard the tiniest sound right behind me. I looked out of the corner of my eye and saw something move in the mirror in front of my back seat. At that moment, I felt a chasm open up in my stomach. I immediately panicked and left the car running as I ran out to the store, alerting my 2-day shift coworkers who had just arrived. We stood behind the store window and watched for a while to see if anyone got out of the car. Meanwhile, my partner called the police, but we didn't see anyone get out of the car during that whole time. When the officers arrived, my car was empty and there was no sign of forced entry. So they assumed that the intruder must have had some illegal copy of a key, or I must have accidentally left the door was unlocked. The thought of this gave me chills. I didn't know which was worse. The fact that the intruder had a key to my car, or that he had been lurking around for days or weeks, waiting for the moment I accidentally left my car doors open to sneak in. I didn't actually get to see the intruder in my car, but I'm pretty sure it was the strange man from weeks ago, and that was the reason I wanted to know which car was mine. It terrifies me to think that maybe he had been trying to get in for the whole month that I hadn't seen him and was waiting for me to forget to lock the doors, although I think I locked them that night, but I'm not sure. Maybe he forgot, or worse, maybe he managed to get a duplicate. Either way, it's something I'll probably never know for sure, but I can't rule it out completely. Whoever it was, though, the man who was there clearly wasn't simply trying to steal the car, as he even tried to stay hidden after I got in and started it. It's horrible to know that I was so close to having left that parking lot and driven off with him in the backseat unknowingly, and once I would have gotten out of there, who knows what would have happened. Maybe he would have waited until I got into my house, or maybe he would have never made it home. It gives me chills just thinking about all the chances this person had that night to hurt me. After that incident, I really stopped feeling comfortable working at that place. The pay was good and the work environment was good, but just the thought that creepy man could still be out there stalking me and waiting for the right moment to hurt me was just something I couldn't deal with. So less than a week later, I put in my resignation and waited a couple of months before getting another night music job. I have worked in a cemetery for the past 17 years. Most of those years I have been on the typical night shift, which was from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. In my mind, working at night had many more benefits than working during the day. Since the daytime employees had more things to do, since more people would visit the yard during the day, there would also be burials that would take place several times a week, which must be organized, and above all, during the whole process, the attendants must be in charge of preparing the grave, arranging the space where the relatives will be, and then taking care of doing the burial work, a job that is quite tiresome to tell the truth. The night shift, on the other hand, and gets paid an extra $2 an hour, and we don't have to do any of that. I must say that I have seen a lot during my years working the night shift at this place. Mostly horrors more earthly than supernatural from Petty. Things like drunken teenagers daring each other to walk through the Campo Santo at night, to grave robbers trying to make off with corpses or with the possible belongings their relatives may have buried them with. I have also seen practitioners of various dark cults trying to come to the cemetery to do witchcraft rituals and such things. However, what happened that night was completely different. I arrived at the small faculty building a little early to chat with the day worker, and once he left, I performed all the normal checks and precautions that protocol indicates at the start of my shift. After that, my only job is really to drive around in a golf cart from time to time around the holy field, making sure nothing unusual happens. I'd say I only run into something once a month, or maybe even every other month anyway. The first few hours were completely normal. I drove around a few times, then went back to the small faculty building for lunch, and I think it was around 2 a.m. When I went back out for another walk around the courtyard, when I got to the other end, I saw something by the fence. It was obviously very dark, so I couldn't see much more than the general shape of a figure standing there. I got as close as I could and saw now that it was a man who was standing on the outside of the fence facing me. I didn't want to confront him if I didn't have to. So I turned around and entered a small loop around the lot to see if he would try to jump the fence while I was gone. But when I returned after a few minutes, he was gone. I scanned the area briefly to make sure he didn't sneak in, but all seemed clear. So I continued my usual patrol. Going around the whole yard takes about 15 minutes, but sometimes I would go slower just to pass the time and make the day less boring. I was going the same way and decided to look again at the place where I saw the man. I really had nothing better to do anyway. I started driving there, and almost immediately I saw the man again. He was inside the yard on the gravel road. I approached again, but the man didn't move, so I got out of the golf cart and started walking towards him. He looked like a 40-year-old man. I stopped just a few feet away from him and said, "Sir, you can't be in here. I need to escort you out." But he didn't even turn his head to look at me. After a second, a slight wave of fear ran through me. After all, who was this man, and what was he doing in the cemetery at this time of night? It frightened me what a thief or a psychopath in full crisis could do, whichever way it went. I was alone and unarmed. Despite the unsettling feeling that was forming inside me, I insisted, "Once again, sir, I need you to come with me." I reached out my hand gently to touch his shoulder, but as soon as I did, he whipped his head around and turned to look at me. This caught me off guard, and I took a step back. Then the man just stared. Into my eyes, he looked full of anger, and after a few seconds of us staring at each other, intense silence, the man turned and started walking away. "What the hell?" I said. Quietly, I went back to my golf cart, preparing to call the police as I watched him walk down to the fence, over it, and continue walking away. I was relieved, but still terrified. I drove straight back to the college and went inside. It was a small one-room security building, but I felt much safer and calmer in there. I sat down and caught my breath. In all my years working at the cemetery, I had never been so scared. I really had a very unsettling feeling. I waited inside for a while. I'm not sure how. along until I heard a knock on the door. I jumped out of my chair and looked towards the door in fear. A few seconds later, they knocked. Again, these were aggressive knocks, not those of someone friendly who wants to ask something or what do I know. No, these were furious and repeated knocks. It seemed that whoever was on the other side wanted to break down the door. I looked around in search of something to defend myself with. As I was trapped there, I had nowhere, but the only thing I had on hand was a thermos of coffee, so I took it to use as a weapon of defense in case it was necessary. Meanwhile, I took the phone from the desk and dialed 911. I didn't know what I wanted or why I was here, but I wasn't going to risk everything to find out. The person kept banging on the door. You could hear it was fists and kicks, but with impressive force. It was something furious, almost as if that person was venting a lot of anger against that door, as if he wanted to beat it down. But he wasn't saying anything. I mean, there was no yelling, no insults, no open the door for me, nothing like that, just frantic banging. And for no apparent reason, I felt really scared. And while I didn't know who was on the other side, I was absolutely sure it was the same guy I had encountered a moment ago. And God knows what he wanted, but after probably about 5 or 10 minutes of continuous banging, I heard footsteps walking away. They could be heard clearly as there was gravel outside and the footsteps were quite audible, although I could no longer hear, and presumably he was gone. It wasn't until the police arrived that I opened the door. They searched the whole place but found no one yet. Remained there for several hours to prevent the assailant from returning. The next day, my manager was able to pull up the building's CCTV security footage. And what I saw was truly horrible. Just a few minutes after I entered the building, a man I had seen in the courtyard earlier approached the door, stood there silently for almost 15 minutes before he started banging on the door. Almost madly, the man was pounding with his arms, legs, and head. He was completely enraged and crazed. As I watched these horrific images, I felt a shiver run through my entire body. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened to me if that man had managed to get into the building. These images were given as evidence to the police, but the man was never identified. From that day on, I requested permission to bring a weapon during my workday for safety. Fortunately, the company granted it. That was about 6 years ago, and to a job in the same cemetery. But I've never seen that guy again. I have been a registered nurse in a general hospital for about 3 years. It's one of the toughest jobs there is, although it's also rewarding, as my job is all about helping people at their most vulnerable times when their health is failing. I work in the intensive care area, so most of my patients are people in serious condition. So most of the time I would be caring for the patient and administering medication. But from time to time, I also provide support in the emergency area. We have had several people come in late at night complaining of fibromyalgia and other common conditions that could easily be treated at home. I often deal with these types of people in the emergency area by simply giving them simple over-the-counter medications if they had insurance. However, there have been a few occasions when we have had to treat patients who really needed it. And in these cases, if the person is too insistent, sometimes placebos can be given. The thing is that treating patients not only makes you feel rewarded, but sometimes you also develop a bond with them, and this story has the same principle. Once I took care of an old man whose wife had just died and he was admitted to the hospital for a severe bacterial infection. His name was Wayne, and he was the sweetest and gentlest grandfather ever taking care of Wayne, more than an obligation. For me, it was a pleasure. He generated a tenderness that I could not even explain. He was also very nice, cheerful, and always told us his life stories, and he really had a very interesting life. He also often talked about his deceased wife, how he met her, and how much he loved her. When I had to take care of Wen, the hours flew by. I really began to develop an emotional connection with him. He was also a great dog lover. He had 3 dogs at home, and every day he would show some concern for them and say he missed them so much and couldn't wait to get out of the hospital to go see them. This broke my heart a little bit because Wen's condition was quite delicate, and the hospital did not allow pets. So he would probably never see his dogs again. As a nurse, it is our responsibility to be there, to be patient, and give emotional support to the patient if required, although this is something that not many nurses do, but I do after all. Someday I will be on the other side, on the patient side, and I would like to receive from my nurse the same dignified and humane treatment that I try to give to my patients one day. Wayne looked at me almost in tears and thanked me for everything I had done for him. This surprised me completely and left me with a great tightness in my chest best as I soon realized what those words meant. Wayne passed away a day later, and I cried for almost a week. The other nurses were sad, but not as sad as I was as he was. One of the people I really cared about, and when he was gone, I felt the grief as if I had lost someone very close. Weeks went by, and I just got over it. It often popped into my head from time to time, but I moved on, as this was something I had to get used to. One night, I was talking to one of my colleagues at the reception desk about a patient's medical history, when she asked me to get a piece of equipment out of the basement. The basement of the hospital is where we usually keep our equipment and other medical supplies for storage. They are not common in most hospitals, but they do exist. It is very rare for one of us to go down to the basement. So this meant we needed something quite important. I took the elevator and pressed the basement level. As I turned on the lights, I had this somewhat creepy feeling. I've been in the basement many times, and I've never had a feeling like this to best describe it. It felt like a feeling of dread coming from somewhere here, but I wasn't sure where to be fair. Basements are creepy in and of themselves, especially hospital basements, but this was the first time I experienced is that in this place I was walking down this little hallway we have, and I grabbed the equipment that was sitting on one of the shelves, and at that moment, I could have sworn I heard footsteps behind me. However, they didn't sound like the footsteps of someone wearing shoes. They sounded like the footsteps of a barefoot person, walking on the tile for a moment. I assumed it was one of my classmates trying to play a joke on me. This would not be unusual. We always played this kind of pranks on each other, so I thought I would catch them in the act and surprise them or whoever it was. But the surprise was mine. I left the room and went back to the main area, but saw no one. At some point, I shouted hello to everyone here. "Don't strain yourselves, guys. I saw you." I hadn't seen anyone, but that would bring down their little joke. However, I didn't get a response. I needed to leave quickly, so I didn't give them any thought and headed for the elevator. But at that moment, I heard loud and clear an old man's voice call my name. The voice echoed throughout the hallway, and yes, it was Wen's voice. I stood frozen in place, my ears wide open, waiting to hear the voice again, and I didn't have to wait long. A few seconds later, I heard Wen's voice calling my name again. Now behind me fighting, the stiffness in my muscles and the panic that was taking over my being, I turned around to see who was behind me, and to my surprise, there was no one. Just the empty hallway. I was now officially scared. I clutched the equipment in my arms and ran out down the hallway until I reached the elevator. I immediately pressed the second floor, which was the area where I was to take the equipment, and after handing it to my friend, I drank a glass of hot coffee almost as if it was a shot. I was visibly upset, so my partner asked me what was wrong with me, but I really didn't want to tell her what had just happened because she probably wouldn't believe me or would think I was making up stories. But I didn't make up anything, that was completely real. Since that day, I have never gone down to the basement alone again, and I never heard Wayne again either. However, I kept him in my prayers for many days so that God would help him find his way to where he belongs. Now, during all these years, I have been a nurse. I have seen and experienced many things, but this was undoubtedly the most frightening of all.